Hi, everybody, and welcome to Contemporary Economic Policy Issues. My name is Jon Haveman. I'm the Executive Director of NEED, the National Economic Education Delegation. Let me take a minute and talk a little bit about what NEED is, and then I'll talk about the course that you signed up and the contemporary economic policy issues that we'll be addressing. So NEED is a nonprofit that I started about 5 years ago, largely out of my displeasure with politicians who, in my estimation, were using economics more as a weapon for their own personal agenda rather than as a tool for social good. And I'd rather they use it as a tool for social good. So, and I figure they get away with that because the electorate doesn't know very much about economic policy issues. And that's not a knock on the electorate, that's a knock on the economics profession. Because we know a ton, we just don't go out and tell anybody. We'll publish it in esoteric journals and move on. So NEED is my way of encouraging the economics profession to get out into the wild, talking to people at Ollie's, at Rotary, at Kiwanee, in high schools, basically wherever people get together and listen to somebody else talk. I would like for a NEED delegate to get in there. I've gotten pretty good buy-in from the economics profession. Have an honorary board with 54 members. Probably the most notable at this point is Janet Yellen, our current Secretary of the Treasury, and Ben Bernanke. Both Janet and Ben were former chairs of the Federal Reserve. Got a bunch of chairs from the President's Council of Economic Advisors, only under both D Democrat and R Republican presidents, some Nobel Prize winners. And then there are currently 652 members of the delegation. The delegation is made up of economists, all of whom have a Ph.D., most of which are academics, who have signed on saying that we think this is a good idea and we'd like to help. So they are helping to write slide decks. We got subject matter experts to write a slide deck on climate change, on the economy, on inequality, on a variety of different things. And then whenever anybody goes out and gives a talk on those subjects, we use the same slide deck. We currently have delegates all over the country. We have at least one, and I think two now, in each of the 50 states. And we give talks on a wide variety of topics. Let me issue an invitation here right at the outset. If you are involved in any other group that brings in speakers, be delighted to send in an economist, if only by Zoom, to talk about any of these important policy issues. Our talks are free, unless the group has deep pockets, in which case we would recommend or suggest some sort of a tax-deductible donation to NEED. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the course. Today, you've got me giving an economic update. Next week, we'll have Alan Deardorff talking about trade and globalization. Then Jeffrey Woglum talking about cryptocurrencies, what's all the excitement about. Ryan Herzog will be in talking about the federal debt and economic inequality. And then Alan will be back to talk about the trade deficit and exchange rates. So again, that's Alan Deardorff talking about trade and globalization, talk about supply chains. Got Jeffrey Woglum talking about cryptocurrencies. Ryan Herzog talking about the national debt and whether or not it's becoming a problem. Ryan back again talking about income inequality. We'll talk about sources, talk about how bad it is and trends. And then Alan again talking about the trade deficit. All right, the trade deficit, which has widened enormously during the course of the pandemic. Okay, so that's the course. That's the syllabus for the course. Today, you've got me talking about the U.S. economy. So let's jump right in on that. First, I want to give credit where credit is due. The slide deck is a joint effort between myself, Scott Bayer at Clemson University, Jeffrey Woglum at Amherst College, Brian Dombeck at Lewis and Clark College, and Doris Guida-Stevenson at Weber State. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? First, we'll talk a little bit about the U.S. economy. We'll talk about whether or not we're going into recession and the general state of the U.S. economy. We'll provide some global comparisons in terms of inflation and GDP growth. Does the U.S. stand out, or is this an international phenomena? We'll talk about inflation specifically, and then we'll talk a little bit about the policy response both to the pandemic and to inflation. But first, let's talk a little bit about the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy is enormous. We currently have a population of about 331 million people. I'm sorry, 333 million people. Of those, about half, or 164.7 million, are in the labor force. That means that that's the number of people who would like to have a job and either have one or are looking for one. Got 152.7 million people who are employed, who have jobs. Gross domestic product, which is the primary measure of the size and growth of GDP, of the economy, excuse me, it's about $25 trillion. That's a number so big I struggle to wrap my head around it. But in a minute, I'll put that in global context. Income per capita, right? If we took all of the income that the economy generates and spread it out evenly across everybody, everybody would get about $65,000. Now, we don't spread it evenly, and Ryan Herzog will talk about how unevenly it is spread. Average hourly earnings in the US are about $32 an hour, right? Which, multiply that out, you get about $65,000. Okay, so those are some basic statistics. Here is US GDP. This is US, what is called nominal GDP. What that means, when something's nominal, it means that it's not adjusted for inflation, right? So we can compare the number in the fourth quarter of 2019 with the second quarter in 2022, but it's not really a fair comparison because inflation will account for some of this growth. But it's kind of instructive to look at what happened to GDP as we went into the pandemic in the second quarter of 2020. We got a significant decline in GDP, and I mean very significant. I'll show you that in just a minute. And we have bounced back. So GDP now is above where it was before the pandemic. In a minute, I'll talk about why I don't care. I care more about where it is relative to where it should be. So that's nominal GDP. Most of the time, we'll be looking at real GDP, not that there's some fake GDP out there, but real just means that it's inflation adjusted. So here's putting the US economy in global perspective. The US has about 23.6% of the global economy. Japan 5.7, China 15.5. Now you can see the composition of the rest of it, right? But the U.S. is enormous, encompassing about 1/4 of the global economy, right? Here's some industry shares of GDP. Manufacturing's over here; it's about 10.9% of GDP. Over here is healthcare; it's about 7.5%. Education, professional, scientific, and technical industries. This is finance and real estate and Wall Street. The information sector, things like LinkedIn, things like Facebook, and a wide variety of others. Transportation, warehousing, and here's the retail sector, accounts for about 5% of GDP. So those are GDP shares, and these won't add up to 100 because it doesn't have all of the sectors of the economy, just some of the bigger ones. Right, and then we can contrast that with employment shares in the United States. Right, so manufacturing, recall I said manufacturing is about 10.9% in terms of its share of GDP. It's only about 8.6% of its share of employment. And over here on the other side, healthcare, which is about 7.4% of GDP, is about 15.2% of employment. Meaning it's a very, very labor-intensive industry, right? Manufacturing is less labor-intensive, and employment, I'm sure we're all aware, employment in manufacturing has been going down pretty rapidly, mostly because of technology, a little bit because of trade, but mostly because of technology. We still produce a ton of stuff, a ton of manufactured goods. We just don't use people to do it anymore. All right, so that's kind of the composition of the U.S. economy. We can compare Los Angeles County with California and the U.S. These blue bars are Los Angeles County, the maroon bars are California, and the green bars are the United States. Right, so manufacturing in 2020 was about 11% of the U.S. economy, less than half that as a percent of California and Los Angeles. Information sector is important in Los Angeles, and healthcare is important in Los Angeles, but again, these numbers will not add up to 100 because we've omitted some sectors. One important sector in Los Angeles is called other services, right? That's like car repair, it's barbershops and nail shops, and that's an outsized industry in Los Angeles relative to both California and the United States. Okay, we can look at employment shares, right? Employment is high in healthcare in Los Angeles. Employment is high in education, high in information, transportation and warehousing, leisure and hospitality, right? And tourism plays a significant role in Los Angeles. So that's kind of how the Los Angeles economy looks, right? Okay, so let's get on to talking about whether or not we're in recession. This was a headline from the New York Times when the second quarter estimates of GDP were first put out, and oh my gosh, we had 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, and so everybody's talking about recession. Well, from an economist's perspective, just because it's kind of a shorthand, just because we have 2 negative quarters doesn't mean we're in a recession. I'll show you in a minute that a lot of other indicators of the economy are still doing pretty well, in particular employment growth. Right, so here is GDP growth on a quarterly basis, and the blue bars going up, they indicate GDP growth in one particular quarter. when the maroon bars are there, that indicates GDP declines in that one particular quarter. And these are at an annualized rate, which means that if the economy grew as fast as it did in that quarter for a whole year, that's how much year-over-year GDP growth would be. But you can see over here at the end, we've got the first quarter of GDP and the second quarter of GDP, both negative. All right, so that's what's got everybody talking about recession. Let's take a closer look at GDP. Right on here, there are two lines. The maroon line is the forecast for GDP that I would have made back in the fourth quarter of 2019. The blue line is what actually happened to GDP, right? And so you can see the enormous drop in GDP in the second quarter of 2020. And we bounced back up in the third quarter and we thought everything was going to be okay. And then things slowed a bit. We got closer to this maroon line, but we haven't gotten back there. We are above the 2019 Q4 level, again, about $500 billion above. That, again, I don't care. We're still about $500 billion below the 2019 forecast, right? And that's what I care about. And, are we back to where we otherwise would have been? Because that's a true recovery. Recovery isn't just getting back to where you were, because in the time that we were down, the economy continued to grow, and we want to catch back up. Okay. All right, so let's talk more about the decline. GDP, there's an accounting identity that every principles of macroeconomics student is taught, and that is GDP equals C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. Right, and that's just that GDP is driven by consumption, the money that you and I spend, by investment on housing, business, and inventories. Right, turns out that if you build up your inventories in one quarter a lot, that adds to GDP. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Government spending plays an important role, and then it's just kind of accounting, taking out the imports from what we consume. So let's talk mostly about housing, business, and inventories, right? So the two quarters, it depends on what's driving the drop. Inventories are driving it. I'll talk about that. Housing, government spending, consumer spending is still okay, but it's slowing. It's certainly slowing. Employment growth is solid, and other indicators are still okay. So let's get into what's driving it, right? First, let's look at consumption. This is the money that you and I spend, and these are positive, right? So these are how much this particular category of GDP contributes to growth. So it contributes about a full percentage point to growth, right? Got negative GDP growth, so there must have been some other part of the economy that offset that 1% growth. And that other part is inventories, right? In the second quarter of this year, inventories fell really significantly. And inventories falling drags down GDP by about 2 2/3%. Right? You can see that in the fourth quarter, let me see if I can get my cursor on there. If you look at the far end, in the fourth quarter of 2021, we had an enormous buildup of inventories. Right? That's in excess of 5% contribution to GDP. Right? Well, they built up inventories in anticipation of a wonderful Christmas season that kind of wasn't. And then they had all those inventories, so GDP was down in the first quarter because people weren't producing stuff. They were selling inventories, and then they sold off inventories in a big way in the second quarter. And it's really inventories that are driving the negative GDP growth, right? And that's just kind of a vagary of the pandemic, how the pandemic has thrown various spanners into the works of the economy, right? And that's just the thing. It's not declaring recession. If you throw that together with all the inflation that we're having, and there are genuine recession worries, right? But at the same time, if we look at things like industrial production, right, this is the producing of stuff in the economy, manufacturing, utilities, and mining, right? It's current in August of this year, it was roughly at the highest level it's been in 20 years, right? So industrial production, we're still making a lot of stuff. If we look at employment, right, this is like the GDP graphs. It's got blue bars and it's got red bars. Blue bars are growth, red bars are declines, and that's the decline in employment we got in April of 2020 with the onset of the pandemic. But you can still see we still got a lot of blue over here. Right, got a lot of blue over. Let's zero in, and we find that in August, 315,000 jobs were created. Right, so these jobs numbers don't look at all like a recession. There's no evidence of a recession here. So right, so this the last 7 months here or 8 months here, that's 2022. All right, there's no indication of recession in employment. There does remain a big employment gap, right? We're about 240,000 jobs above where we were before the pandemic set in, right? 152 million.74 instead of 152 million.5, but we're 6.3 million jobs below where we otherwise would have been. And again, it's the otherwise where we would have been. That's what I care about. I don't care about, yes, we recovered where we were 3 years ago. That's not largely relevant to me. Now, low wage employment is particularly lagging. All right, this shows you where employment in various parts of the economy, the middle wage sector, the high wage sector. Middle wage is those making 29 to 73,000. High wage is those above 73,000. Low wage is those less than $29,000 a year. And this is the change relative to January 15 of 2020. All right, still down in the high wage and the low wage sectors. Right, so we should be worried about the low wage workers, but we had lots of stimulus spending. The government spent $5 trillion in stimulus during the pandemic. So low income workers were able to maintain their consumption, and indeed they increased their consumption relative to January 15. They increased it by about 20%. High income groups only increased it by about 8%. Right, so the low income part of the economy is doing okay, because we fed their pocketbooks with lots of government spending. And I don't mean that pejoratively at all. It may have sounded that way, but we needed to. It was good that we did. Okay. There is a big question, right? If there is this employment gap, right, part of that's driven by the fact that there aren't workers out there looking for work. So let's think about, where have all the workers gone? Well, this is looking at our labor force, right? This is the labor force relative to where it should have been. Labor force, remember, is the number of people that want a job, either have a job or are looking for a job. And it's just above where it was pre-pandemic, but it's still about 3.7 million below where we should be. Right? What explains that? Well, a lot of different things. There are exits from the labor force amongst those aged in the prime working years from 28 to 25 to 54. Those who are younger, 16 to 24, right? So this blue area, that represents the number of 16 to 24-year-olds that have dropped off out of the labor force. This gray area, that's the number of people aged 25 to 54. The green, that's early retirements, people between 54 and 64 who decided to retire, right? And then the demographic exits here, we're in a situation where the baby boom is retiring, right? So normal retirements are relatively high, having nothing to do with the pandemic, just the age distribution. And then people coming into the labor force, it's relatively low. Again, nothing to do with the pandemic, just because of our history, right? And the baby boom, right? So that's part of why labor force is down. But there's about 2.4 million early exits and early retirements from the labor force that partly explain why we're down so many jobs, right? And part of these early exits are because of long COVID. It's estimated, some economists, I think at Stanford, just estimated that there are about 500,000 people in the United States who are out of the labor force, not looking for a job, don't have a job, because they're suffering from long COVID. That's not a small number. It's not a small number. It's an important thing to keep in mind. We can zero in on Los Angeles County. Los Angeles County was doing okay until recently. It's trending down. This is employment growth in Los Angeles County. The blue line there. I'm sorry, my computer's doing something. Okay, there we're back. Right, so the blue line here, this is employment growth in Los Angeles County. See, it was tracking the green line, United States and California pretty well over time. But it's now down about a little bit over 5% relative to where we were pre-pandemic. That's not good. California and the United States are, again, right about where we were. In terms of labor force, the labor force is actually shrinking in Los Angeles County. Not sure exactly why that is, but things that economy is struggling a little bit more than most. All right, so let's look a little bit at inflation. These are the latest figures. Inflation was 8.3% in August. Now, it's worth mentioning that inflation is defined as the change in prices from this time last year. So over the course of the last year, inflation increased by 8.3%. Now, over the course of the last month, it increased by almost nothing. Over the course of the month before that, it increased by almost nothing, right? So we're making progress. Inflation is down, but it's still much higher than was expected. And stock markets certainly reflected a disappointment in these numbers. We can look at the various sectors, right? So between July and August, the inflation rate, when you consider all items, month over month, was zero, right? It was zero. So that's good. But then there was a lot of decline in gasoline, airline fares, fuel, oil, used cars, and trucks. That was offset by some increases in piped utility gas service. Apparel is up, motor vehicle maintenance is up. That's a parts issue having to do with supply chain. Electricity is up. Again, that's a fuel issue. I don't know why tobacco and smoking products are up. Maybe people have taken up smoking more during the pandemic. So there was some up and there was some down, right? Overall, it was zero month over month. Now we can look at the US economy, and there are a wide variety of different indicators out there. And here are a bunch of them plotted on this graph that's got four quadrants. If you're up here in the upper left, these are measures that are bad but are getting better. So that's inflation. That's sort of consumer sentiment. Payroll, employment is getting better. Here, there are things that are good and getting better. Investments in capital goods, industrial production, and unemployment claims. Unemployment claims are pretty low. Down here in the lower right-hand corner, things that are bad and getting worse. Personal income, manufacturing, and trade sales. So consumer spending is declining a little bit. Over here that are good but are getting worse, again, is consumer spending. The unemployment rate ticked up a little bit. Average hourly earnings is slowing. The growth rate of it is slowing. Job openings, building permits. So we're all over the place in terms of the economy. Some things are good, getting better. Some things are bad, getting worse. Some things are in the middle. And so economists have a hard time looking at these data and saying, yeah, we're in a recession. It just doesn't look that way. Let's compare the US to other countries, right? In terms of inflation, the US inflation rate in these data is 8.5%. In the Netherlands, it was 12. In Spain, it was 10. United Kingdom, 10, right? So there are a bunch of other countries that we consider to be our peers that also have very high rates of inflation. Part of the reason for this is that the price of imported products, the inflation, if you just look at imported products, has been very, very high, right? And that's going to encourage domestic producers to raise their prices because they compete with the prices of imported products. So competition is down, and it's partly a result of supply chain issues, right? But once supply chain issues are better, once imported prices start coming down, then inflation will come down at a more rapid rate. We can also look at GDP. You compare US GDP, right? Remember in the second quarter, it was down 0.6%. The Netherlands, 2.6%, doing okay. But most of the other countries have GDP growth of 1% or less, right? And that is much slower than we're all used to. Right? It's kind of a global summary here. Developed economies are uniformly down. Not entirely a surprise. We all suffered from the same pandemic. The bounce back from the early closures was rapid in most countries, but we've all got slow growth going. We have very little experience with this type of a global shock, right? Different countries dealt with it in different ways, but we are all interconnected. So it seems reasonable that we're all going to be on a similar cycle. It's somewhat surprising because the economic responses were different, as I mentioned. However, significant stimulus was common theme. Countries spent a lot of money and borrowed a lot of money. Supply chain issues, common theme. Shifts from purchases of services to goods was a very common theme. And now the shift back, we're buying less goods and more services. I'll show you that in a minute, right? So let's focus in. So that's enough about the global economy and where the US sits. The US is not an outlier by any sense in terms of what's happening. It's happening all over the globe. In terms of inflation, right? Again, here are the numbers. I showed you the 8.2. Actually, in the New York Times, they had it at 8.3%, but we're running about 8.2%. There's this other measure on here that's called core inflation, right? This is the consumer price index. This is the headline number. The core inflation number is also the consumer price index, but what we've done is taken out food and energy, two sectors of the economy where prices fluctuate quite a lot. Right, it's down at 6.3%, still quite elevated, as us all concerned. Right, gas prices are coming down. Gas prices were upwards of $5 a gallon. Now they're at about 3 2/3, a little bit more. Right, so that's good, and that's helping keep inflation trending down. In terms of history, right, if we look at this again is the nominal, the not inflation adjusted price of gasoline. It looks like $5 a gallon is uncharted territory, but we've been there before. right? We were there throughout much of the latter part of the aughts. We were there throughout much of the first part of the last decade, right? So we've seen gas prices this high, and now we're coming down. Fuel costs are still elevated. This is general fuel, all of it. It's up 48.8% year over year, whereas the CPI, that's the blue line, is the CPI, is just up again 8.2%. Right, so fuel prices are still driving a lot of the inflation that we're experiencing. Food prices also driving it. The maroon line here, that's the annual price change in food. In August, it was 11.4%. Oddly, 13.5% of that was for food at home. 8% was from food away from home, right? And that makes some sense because we did an about face going into the pandemic, where people cooking at home more, going out to eat less. And our supply chains were oriented towards getting food into these buckets. And now we have to change buckets. So that tends to lead to inflation. More on that in just a second. Let's talk about inflation. How does it work? Right? We can have demand pull, right? If suddenly everybody wants to buy a pair of Michael Jordans, then the price of Michael Jordans is going to go up, right? So if demand goes up, as it did during the pandemic for goods, if people want to buy goods instead of services, then the price of goods is going to go up. The economy is like a massive container ship or a massive cruise ship, right? You can't just pivot it on a dime. It takes a long time for it to turn. And while it's turning, prices are going to reflect the fact that demand is a little bit out of whack. There's cost push, right? If the cost of helium goes up, then the cost of helium balloons is going to go up. Similarly, if the cost of microchips goes up, then the cost of cars go up, right? That kind of thing. I'll show you a couple of examples. And then there's built-in. Many of you are probably familiar with the notion of a wage price spiral, right? If prices go up, then people ask for a raise. If people get a raise, then prices go up again, and people ask for more of a raise and prices go up. It's not clear that that's ever been really a thing, more something that people have talked about. Even in the late 70s, it's not clear that that was happening. Right, I talked about spending patterns changing, right? So the maroon line is the trend of purchases of goods, and the blue line is trend of purchases of services. The maroon line high above where it otherwise would have been during the pandemic, and the blue line much below. Right now, right, goods spending is up 14.3% relative to where it was at the start of the pandemic. It's coming down. And services spending is up 0.7%, and it's going up. So the economy is getting back into whack, if you will, right? So spending patterns change, that leads to inflation, because we can't just start producing more of whatever people want. It takes time. And in that time, prices go up, okay? And this is part of the demand pull, right? Cost push, right? Over here on the right, we've got used car prices. Why did used car prices go up? Well, used car prices went up because new car prices went up. And new car prices went up because they couldn't get the microchips to put in the new cars. And it turns out if you don't have a microchip, you can't put a new car out on the market. So the cars that did go out, very expensive and hard to find. So people who needed to buy a car were driven to the used car market. And used car prices went up by about a quarter. Over here on the left-hand side, we've got building materials inflation. Right, and that's really what's going on in lumber yards all over the country, all over the world. Right? When the pandemic set in, lumber yards just stopped producing wood. So the price of it went up. There was a dearth of it, right? And prices are still elevated. This is cost push, right? Supply chain problems were endemic throughout the pandemic. No pun intended there, or a rhyme. But this is an index of global supply chain pressures put together by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Right? And 0 is when there's no particular pressure. When it's negative, that means that there's a lot of slack in the system. When it's positive, it means there's a lot of pressure on the system. Goods are going to arrive more slowly, and they're going to be more expensive. Well, we're still at 1.47, which is down significantly from above 4 where we were. Right? So supply chain issues are getting better, but they remain, and they are continuing to be a part of the inflation story. Right, and this is cost push, right? The longer it takes to get stuff, the more expensive they are, and the more scarce they are because they can't arrive, the higher the price is going to be. Right, then there's the Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation. It's called the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, right? And it's thought to be better by economists because it keeps track of what people buy better. Right, when the price of something goes up, that's going to raise the CPI. But when the price of something goes up, it's also going to cause people to stop buying it. Right? So the fact that people stopped buying expensive things is reflected in the PCE, not in the CPI as well. Right? And so inflation here, right, 6.3% and kind of trending down in the same way that CPI is. Right, so let's talk about my diagnosis for the uptick in inflation. Right, spending patterns have changed dramatically towards goods away from services. There were supply chain issues that affected some areas in particular, but the supply chain issues have had a broad impact on the economy. Right, there was too much total spending. As I think I mentioned, the Federal Reserve threw $5 trillion out into the economy, and we're pretty good spenders, so we spent most of it. We still have about $2 trillion in excess savings, right? And that excess savings is going to continue to give us strong retail sales and strong consumption numbers. That's going to help continue to drive inflation up as the Federal Reserve tries to fight it. Who's to blame? Who knows? And it's not much worth placing blame, but the American Recovery Plan was probably too big, and the Fed could have acted sooner, right? I had the same sanguinity, if you will, that the Fed did, that inflation was going to correct itself pretty rapidly. That didn't happen, and now the Fed is kind of in a hard spot, right? And actually tomorrow, I think we're going to find out what the Federal Reserve does with its core rate of interest, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. Measure of expectations in terms of inflation. There are two kinds of treasuries. There are nominal treasuries and there are real treasuries. All right, real treasuries are called TIPS, the inflation protected treasuries that are inflation protected, right? And if you buy a security that's inflation protected, they're going to pay you a lower interest rate on it than if you buy one that's not, right? So if we compare the interest rate between those that are not protected for inflation and those that are, we get a measure of what the market expects inflation to do. And over the course of the next 5 years, market expects 2.5% inflation. Over the next 10 years, a little bit less. It's still right around 2.5% inflation. So the market is kind of sanguine that inflation is going to start to correct itself in the relatively near future. So what's the Fed doing about it? All right, well, the Fed is increasing its federal funds rate. Let me stop back and tell you exactly what the federal funds rate is, right? The federal funds rate is the rate that banks charge each other overnight to borrow money, right? And why do banks borrow money from each other overnight? Well, at the end of the day, the Federal Reserve says you have to have cash reserves on hand. And if at the end of the day, you're a bank and your cash reserves are too small, you have to get them from somewhere. So you borrow them from a bank whose cash reserves are too big, right? So this interest rate actually has ramifications for the rest of the economy, right? Part of the ramifications are from the fact that this raises costs for banks. So it's going to raise interest that it pays for people for investment borrowing. It's going to be more expensive to borrow for investments. Home loans are going to go up. Mortgage rates, I'll show you that in a minute. Car loan rates are going to go up. Credit card rates, savings accounts are going to pay you a positive rate of interest. It may be 0.02 instead of 0.01, but it'll be positive, and many more. So let's look at some interest rates, right? So here are the interest rates paid on U.S. Treasuries, right? And about the time the Fed started really increasing its interest rate, the interest rate paid on these went up. There's an alarming compression of interest rates. This is the difference between the 10-year Treasury and the 2-year Treasury, right? It's usually the interest rate on the 10-year is higher than that on the 2-year, because if somebody's going to hold your money for a longer period of time, they got to pay you more for it, right? But usually when we have this inversion, an inverted yield curve, right before the gray bars are recessions, right before recessions, right, we get a recession. So we've got an inverted yield curve now, and that's pointing a lot of people towards recession, but I'm still not sure. Mortgage rates are going up. The 30-year and is now a little bit over 6%. So that's very high, higher than it's been in a very long time, and it's responding to, right. You can see right here is where the Fed has started increasing federal funds rate, and mortgage rates followed, ticking right up. So some takeaways, right? Is a recession on the horizon? I don't think so. A lot of really smart people think so. Larry Summers is a conservative economist. He's kind of a doomsayer. He thinks so. Jamie Dimon runs Citibank. He thinks so, but I think he's trying to set investor expectations. And Elon Musk is worried about it, but I kind of stopped paying attention to what Elon Musk says a while ago. The chances of slipping into recession are elevated, but I think on many fronts the economy is still doing okay, and hopefully we can avoid it. Consumers are driving the recovery, and consumers account for 2/3 of GDP, and consumer spending is still pretty strong. Right? Job creation is robust. 315,000, actually that should read in August. What about GDP? Yes, it was minus 1.6 in the first quarter, minus 0.6 in the second. But again, that was all driven by adjustments in inventories, right? The adjustments were really big, so they had a really big overall effect. And housing markets are slowing because interest rates are going up, so people aren't buying. If people aren't buying a house, they aren't buying all the stuff that they need to put in the house, right? So that's tough on the economy. And government spending increases demand. When government spending is falling, demand falls off, right? So it's inventories, it's housing markets, and it's government spending that's driving the slowdown in GDP. Those things can all turn around. Let's take a look at the role of the policy, right? Was this a policy-induced inflation or downturn, right? The question is, what's responsible for the cycles related to the pandemic? And we were going to have massive cycles regardless of what the federal government, either Congress or the Federal Reserve, did. The United States spent $5 trillion in pandemic-related programs. There's still $2 trillion in excess savings. What role did local shutdowns play? What role did the nature of business support play, in particular the lack of support for small businesses? Was it all driven by natural fear and self-preservation, right? Buying goods and going out to dinner less, people leaving the labor force, bouncing back too aggressively and optimistically? That's the inventory struggle. And natural struggles of the economy to respond to changes, right? How much of it was policy induced versus how much of it was normal? And how much did the policy sort of narrow the band of economic variability? We don't know, and I imagine economists will work very hard to answer these questions as we go forward. Right? Did politicians get us into this mess? Policy clearly played a significant role, but again, it's universal in developed countries all around the world. And to the extent that policy got it wrong, the Washington sausage making, if you're going to do something fast, you're not going to do it very well. But if you do something really slowly, you may well miss the opportunity of the window of opportunity. Haste makes waste. Pandemic spending was clearly not as thoughtful as it might have been. There's a lot of blame to throw around. Economies just don't respond very well to significant shocks. Can politicians and policymakers get us out of it? Well, no. I mean, we're in a really tough spot. President Biden, he really has very little control over aggregate demand or prices. We could put a lot of government spending out there. That would raise GDP, but it would also raise inflation. Right, so we've got this push me pull you kind of darned if we do and darned if we don't. We can keep GDP afloat, but then we risk exacerbating inflation, which might have more long-term problems. We can put in price controls at the same time we spend more, but nobody really wants that. Congress is similarly hamstrung. Federal Reserve is acting aggressively, which seems to be paying off. Bottom line, politicians did what they felt was necessary. I think they did the best they could. The pandemic just wreaked havoc on the economy in ways that neither politicians nor economists have the answer to. Right? Blaming anybody for actions or inactions, I think, is not reasonable. I think that there are actors in Congress, there are actors in the Fed who have been acting in good faith throughout all of this, and we really don't know. Had the Fed acted sooner, we really don't know if it would have made much of a difference. Because inflation, as I mentioned, import prices, the Fed doesn't have much control over import prices, and that's a big consideration in terms of domestic price setting. We're really left with the Fed doing the best that it can and with being patient. I know that that's not a very good answer. I'd like to have the silver bullet in figuring out how to both keep the GDP rising and inflation down, but it just doesn't exist, alas. Okay, that's what I have on the economy. Next week is Alan Deardorff, who will be here to talk more about trade and I'm sure about import prices. Here's how you can get a hold of me. You're watching this video, so you can pause here if you want to shoot me an email with any questions. I'd be delighted to try to answer them. And I will put these slides up on NEED's website, and I'll send a link to your OLLI as to that. Hopefully they'll send out to you as to just where you can find the slides. Okay. That's what I have. One other thing, I've got a bunch of graphs up for local economies. If you're interested in your local economy and how it's doing, you can go to this part of the NEED website and get a sense for exactly how it's doing. Okay, that's all that I have. Thanks so much for for watching the video. I appreciate it. And I do hope that you will sign on for more need courses or for the rest of this course. All right. Thanks very much. Be well, everybody.